So the thing about MCQs is that they're not particularly difficult as time goes on because MCQs are a mix of two things. The first one being strategies of how to approach them, and the second, it's really just time and practice and just getting that muscle memory down. There's no shortcut around MCQs. Some people are a little bit better with like a stronger foundationed reading comprehension level. But beyond that, it's really just kind of what you are able to recognize from College Board, the type of questions they give you, the type of passages they give you, and the general approach that you should be doing for the different types of readings given, right? So for this video, I want to go over two things. The first one being a couple of short strategies of what to expect, and the second one to go over the laziness MCQ and just thinking about like why an answer is correct above others, right? And the first four slides deal with the kind of like type of questions you'll be given here. The first one's just meaning of words and phrases. So one of the most common things you'll see in like AP or SAT are questions where it's like, well, what does this word mean? But that's not so easy, not just like dictionary definition, because as we know, words have a bunch of different definitions to them, and depending on time period of the work or depending on what the subject matter is, the word can also change, right? So two things we can do for these types of questions. The first one's substitution, right? Just thinking about if I took one of the sample answers that they gave me and I substituted it with the section of where we're looking at that word itself, does it still make sense, right? And it's a very common technique that we'll do here of substituting words to see if they make sense and if it would fit one for one, essentially, in those categories there. But there's another one where we read a line up and we read a line down. So it's essentially like context clues, right? Sometimes the text does kind of like manipulate a word where it might be particular to an author's work or its subject or what have you. So you're gonna have to read a little bit more before and after to kind of get an idea of like what is really being said here using this word. So this is one of the types of questions you'll get on the AP exam and SATs as well. Just thinking about like the definitions of words and phrases and the semantics of it basically when they change from reading to reading here. The second one is going to be comprehension of whole, meaning just comprehension, you know what I mean? Like just thinking about key words, key terms, key ideas that they want you to explain after reading this entire passage here. Now the thing is, they're going to give you questions where they ask you to read the entirety of it to kind of get like a big summary idea of the entire reading, or to kind of explain what's happening in a paragraph here and there. And so it's the comprehension of the whole reading or comprehension of the whole paragraph that is isolated there. All we're going to consider for this is just thinking about reading speed, right? And we did like a little talk in the early parts of the year about speed reading. And so a lot of the AP exams passages are, I think, within like 550 to about 650 words. They're not super long. And so you're going to have to like think about how to approach understanding the entire reading, how to make sure you can bullet point the body paragraphs themselves to kind of like get a, again, comprehension of the whole, right? They're going to ask you for the big idea type questions there. So just making sure that you can kind of read effectively and not just kind of like skim it and kind of get a gist of it. Not really helpful to like just have like a broad idea, right? To really know what's happening from section to section there. They're going to ask you for stylistic choices. So this is where like rhetorical analysis comes back, right? So they're going to ask you questions about like, why do this as a writing choice? What device do you see here? They don't ask you for anything like crazy in terms of devices. They don't ask you for things that are like super rare, what we call the Latiness. There's something called Latiness where the device is like more obscure or it's a bit of a rarer choice. An example, I guess, would be like chiasmus, I think would be an example of a Latinate. I'm not entirely sure. But it's one that's like not super common, right? And they usually have like Latin naming to them there. That's why they're called Latinates. But they usually ask you for things like tone, obviously, right? Or diction, or maybe like as much as like parallelism and around that general category there. So just thinking about what patterns you see in the writing and what those patterns translate into for devices there. That's why like motifs and stuff are always really like useful to look at. Is this author using a lot of questioning? Is this author using a lot of anaphora? Keeping an eye for stuff like that really pays off in the end there. And lastly, they're going to be asking you some soapstone questions, right? So questions about who's the speaker, what's the occasion, who's the audience, what's the purpose. So just kind of think about the big idea of what's going on in this piece. Because remember, everything they give you is rhetorical, right? And so when something's rhetorical, we do think like, how's the speaker trying to connect themselves to the reader? How is this occasion important to warrant like a speech or an essay or whatever? So I'm just thinking about like how all these different things boil down into a reading altogether there. So we're just thinking about like what contributes to the whole of the piece. And so one of the things you got to do is you got to learn how to scan, for any AP reading. If you look at this little bit from the very top of the laziness reading, right, they'll give you these italics here where they'll tell you what kind of work it is, what year it's from, and that should give you kind of an idea of how to approach it. So if I'm looking at this italics, it says the following passage is excerpted from a recent book of essays. And I'm thinking like, okay, it's an essay. And essays and speeches are usually a lot easier to read. There are some that are trickier when they talk about like philosophy or politics, or maybe it's like an obscure narrative, right? So in this case, I'm thinking like, okay, it's an essay, so it still follows like thesis, topic, sentence, body, paragraph format. It shouldn't be too tricky to read. On the other hand, I'm thinking about like, okay, well, what is this generally about? I'm scanning this reading here. If you look at the first line, for example, it says there's something preemptive about laziness, something that smacks of a decision to refuse all offers even before they're put on the table. I'm reading that and I'm like, oh, it's about laziness, right? So I think, and I read the entire thing in a quick skim there, and I'm kind of like preparing my mind and my eyes to think about what this reading is about. And I'm thinking, oh, well, you know, laziness, we can all relate to it. And it's not a particularly difficult or alien topic there. So we should be easy to, you know, pick up the ideas. So it's, on first glance, a more modern type reading, right? The language itself is not like 1700s, kind of like that fancy sublime type language there is pretty approachable. One of the techniques I want to talk about in terms of MCQs is the topic sentence read. So if you're ever given like an essay, like a more modern version, I say like 1900s and up, right? If you're given like a more modern-ish type reading, try reading just the topic sentences first to get a general idea of the whole, because it's an essay. So it still follows the format of topic sentence, evidence, explanation, so forth and so on, right? And by doing so, you can get kind of like a big comprehension of the entire piece without having to spend too much time with it there. So it's kind of like just preparing your mind and your, again, eyes for the following reading here. Let's try it out real quick. In this reading, there were 6 paragraphs. And what I've done here is I'm just going to look at the topic sentences and think about what I can draw from them as the possible main idea of the paragraph, right? And for some of them, I maybe like drew a little bit more than just a sentence, but you don't have to read too far into it to really get the gist of it, right? So for me, in the 6 paragraphs, and you can read them on your own, well, assuming you've read them already, right? The way I've summarized it was, okay, first paragraph, it deals with how laziness pushes everything away. It makes one lethargic and not wanting to contribute, right? Or to invest or whatever. We think about in the second paragraph, there's more to laziness than we know. It's not just like someone being lazy, right? There's also like motivation as a process, or like there might be just kind of like boredom as a factor. It's not just because people are inherently lazy. In the third paragraph, one can't define or explain laziness, it just occurs naturally. So the author is making like an argument that laziness is something more like intrinsic, right? It's not just something that is bestowed onto somebody, I guess. It's just something that like springs from the inside. It's kind of like synonymous with like, I guess, depression in some ways. You can't really explain depression. It just like occurs in people sometimes there. There may be like some possible lead ups to it, but all in all, it's just something that is hard to really pinpoint. In the fourth paragraph, author asks a rhetorical question on occurrence of laziness. So in this case, author asked, but do any two people react identically to the same stimuli? So it kind of begs the question of like, is laziness universal in the way that we understand it to be? Maybe not. Maybe laziness is particular to the individual, right? So you can see like how there's like a line of reasoning so far on the topic of laziness. It's not just like a basic idea like, oh, this person's lazy. It's laziness is maybe something that we have to like better understand to really tackle or to address altogether, right? And so if we look at the fifth paragraph now, now it's focusing on the speaker, him or herself. We don't know, who the speaker is exactly, but now they're talking about their own personal anecdotes of laziness there. And then later at the very last paragraph, the speaker talks about how they master laziness there. So there's kind of like a redemption story, I guess, to it here, where they kind of like spend the first 4 paragraphs talking about the general ideas of laziness, and the last 2 talks about their own personal experiences with laziness, right? With this information, now we have a better POV understanding of this piece here. Now we can read it with a kind of like I always say like a primer, if you know what that means. It's kind of like I'm preparing myself so that when I go into the paragraphs, I'm not like entirely blind, right? Like I'm thinking, okay, this is about their personal life, so they're going to talk about like experiences. They're going to talk about relating themselves to the audience, maybe, right? So it's really useful to read topic sentences first if it's like, again, a formal essay, because it helps us kind of keep an eye out for what each paragraph is generally about, and later anticipate what elements should be there for us to find in our reading of it, right? And so I also prepare for you, I'm sorry, the paragraphs and the kind of like summary of what each one is, essentially, right? And I just want to kind of let you know what you should have read and to make sure you're reading accurately for this piece here. And then later I have the answers as well, so I have my reasonings for each one, and then later just going to fall through and just figure out why it's, the answer there, right? For this one, I'll let you kind of like go through yourself, because you have the slides for this one here. And then for the next video, I want to go a little bit more in depth into how to do like process elimination and to approach that one there. But this one, I just kind of, see if you can kind of go through these answers and to think like, oh, I got that one right because of this, but maybe I missed this one because of that reason there. So like going through the rationales and figuring what is exactly right and wrong for MCQs.